this most important message of Judaism is the Lord is one. And to me, that means I am one with the Lord. And the Lord is one with everything. And I am one with everything. And I embrace the whole universe. And for me, that means there's no other. There's no outsider. We're all intimately connected.
I'm honestly so excited to be here with you. I've been a fan of your projects for such a long time now.
Oh.
It's really incredible to be here with almost like a figment of my, like there are these characters that are like figments of your imagination because they played such a vital role in your own journey, and now to sit here face to face. So my plan for the interview, if this is cool with you, is I'm going to begin by giving you a short introduction, and then I was actually really interested in some of the more autobiographical things that you shared about your own journey and your family and your own upbringing. And as you can imagine, this may not come as a massive surprise. I am a Hasidic Jew interested in Jewish mysticism and in global mysticism and the relationship between individual religious traditions and global mysticism and spirituality.
Okay. Are you wearing a kippah?
Yes, you bet.
Oh yeah, I couldn't see it at first.
Yes.
There we go.
And Tzitz is here.
Okay.
Yes. So let's kick this off. Jeffery Mishlove is a clinical psychologist, and correct me if I'm saying any mistakes here, the host and producer of First Thinking Aloud, a TV show which is now available on YouTube, and now New Thinking Aloud. Between the two channels, he has over 15 million views and 135,000 subscribers. Jeffery initially got interested in studying psychology and religion, and he actually wrote his senior master thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism, and he completed his PhD in parapsychology. As far as I'm aware, it's the only PhD that was awarded by an accredited university for parapsychology from Berkeley in the year 1980, before I was born, and a revised version of his doctoral dissertation was published as Psi Development Systems, and along with that, he's the author of other books such as Roots of Consciousness, The PK Man, and others. And the reason why Jeffery is here with us today is because anyone who's in the field of mysticism, which is what we here explore at Seekers of Unity, will be very hard to have not come across Jeffery Mishlove, Dr. Mishlove, because he has interviewed some of the most outstanding characters and thinkers in the world of spirituality, psychology, and mysticism. Just to name a very brief few, I could spend the next 10 minutes just naming the stars and the true characters that Jeffery has had the great privilege of interviewing. But people like Colin Wilson, David Chalmers, Huston Smith, Irvin Yalom, John Searle, Oliver Sacks, Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi, Ram Dass, Robert Anton Wilson, Rollo May, Rupert Sheldrake, Shinzen Young, Stanislav Grof, Steven Pinker, Terence McKenna, and Whitley Strieber, just a pick of names from the many, many names. And Jeffery, thank you so much for joining us here firstly. It's honestly such a pleasure to be here with you.
It's a pleasure to be with you as well.
Thank you. And I want to just take, before I introduce you and allow you to share your own personal story and how you got to where you are today, which is how we begin our interviews. From any of the names that I just read out in those list of interviews, did any of them bring back any particular memories, any particular flashbacks to those great people that you got to spend time with?
Well, actually, they all do.
Nice. Nice.
But because of your background, the one that stuck out in my mind the most was Rabbi Zalman Schachter-Shalomi. He was a dear friend.
Yes. I actually do hope to hear more about your relationship with Reb Zalman, a character who in my own life has been somewhat of an inspiration, a controversial figure within the Orthodox world, and someone who opened up my eyes to alternative ways of thinking about Jewish spirituality and mysticism in a more global context. And I want to hold off because I know that comes only later in the story. And I want to really take us back to the beginning, take us back to who Jeffery was as a young child. And if you could walk us through in your own words, I want to hear your story to where we are today, just to catch us all up,
Well, I was born in Wisconsin, Fond du Lac, Wisconsin in 1946. On December 4th, it was a cold winter day when my parents took me home from the hospital. They told me that as soon as we got outside that I picked my head up and started to look around, which they said is very unusual for a young infant to do that. And I suppose it's sort of symbolic.
Yes.
I've been looking around ever since.
Nice, nice. So what was the family that you were raised in? Give us a bit of an idea of what the family was like.
My father was in the Army when they got married. My mother was from New Jersey. My father's family grew up in Wisconsin. My father, incidentally, since I know you're an Orthodox Hasidic Jew, my father grew up in a very Orthodox Jewish family. My mother didn't. My mother grew up in a very secular Jewish family. So I have both of those viewpoints were around me growing up. Although, to be honest, my father actually, as soon as he could, he got involved in the world of business. And I did have a traditional Jewish upbringing in Wisconsin of the sort that they had at that time, which is that Jewish people in the 1950s tried very hard to fit in, to become mainstream Americans. So there was no talk of Hasidism or Jewish mysticism whatsoever. And instead, I was raised with the understanding that Judaism is the most logical of all religions.
Yes.
But I'll tell you an interesting story. My Uncle
Please.
Harry, my father's mother, my grandmother, Anna Schwam, had a brother. And they were both orphaned. And they grew up around the town of Lubavitch in Russia. They were Lubavitcher Hasidim. I didn't know this growing up.
This is your grandparents?
My grandmother on my father's side and her brother,
Got it.
who was my great Uncle Harry.
Got it.
And my grandmother died when I was 5. I didn't get to know her very well, but I knew that. To give you an idea of how Orthodox they were, they lived in a tiny town in Wisconsin called Ripon, birthplace of the Republican Party, incidentally. And they brought in a Jewish scholar from Sheboygan, where my Uncle Harry lived, into the household to give my father his bar mitzvah lessons. And at one point, my grandmother caught this man shaving on the Shabbos. So she fired him for breaking the Shabbos. So they were a very strict household. That may have been as well, it was during the Depression. Maybe there were other motives as well, for all I know. But they were a very religious household. And my Uncle Harry ran a little grocery store in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. He lived behind the store. And as a child, we would love to visit him. And he always, every time we came over for a visit, he'd take us into the store where he had a freezer and he'd pull out Eskimo pies for all of the children. So to me, he was like the richest man in the world. He had his big supply of Eskimo pies. What more could you want? But I didn't see much of Uncle Harry at all until, well, as I grew up and went to college. I hadn't seen him for over 10 years. And then one day, I was already living in California. I was in graduate school. I had a very powerful dream. This would have been about 1972. Uncle Harry came to me in the dream and began speaking to me very, very deeply about my life. And as I remember, using the symbolism of the yin-yang, Chinese. But he moved me so deeply that when I woke from the dream, I was crying and singing at the same time. I woke up singing Avinu Malkeinu, which is, I've never had that happen before or since. And, to awaken from a dream crying and singing. In fact, not even one or the other, let alone both. So I wrote home. I said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." My mother phoned me as soon as she got my letter saying, "How did you know Uncle Harry had just died?"
Wow.
I asked for something of his, a possession of his, so I could remember him by, and they sent me a book. They said this was Uncle Harry's favorite book. And it was in Yiddish. It took me a while. I had to get it translated, but it turned out to be Tales of the Baal Shem Tov. So that's when I came to realize that I had a Hasidic tradition within my own family that I
Wow.
was totally unaware of until Uncle Harry had died.
Wow.
Now, I've subsequently learned that many of his other descendants, some of his grandchildren and other cousins, also had experiences like that around Uncle
Really?
Harry and his death. Yes.
Wow, around his passing. Wow, that's incredible. Wow, that story gives me chills. I mean, to have such a powerful dream and then to, I mean, we would call it, in the Hasidic world, we would call it Hashgacha Pratis, and in the more, I don't know, psychological world, we'd call it a synchronicity, such a, you know, that for those to occur simultaneously, that must have moved you quite deeply. That must have been quite a strong moment for you.
It was, yes. It was one of the things that really motivated me to understand, you know, what's going on here. And I was enrolled in school. I began asking my professors to tell me, what did they have anything intelligent or meaningful they could say about this kind of an experience? And I quickly learned they didn't. They had nothing intelligent whatsoever to say. So that's when I resolved that it would be worth it for me to become my own expert on this kind of thing. And that's really what propelled me to pursue a career in parapsychology.
Wow. So I want to, Jeffrey, that's incredible. I want to continue that trajectory and learn more about your own process of learning. But I just want to stop and pick into a bit more of your family's detail. Mm-hmm. So your grandmother and your grandmother's brother, who you were very close with and have fond memories, came from Lubavitch and grew up in a Lubavitch household. What influence did their own Hasidic lifestyle have on your life? Were there any elements which were passed along through your father, through the books that you read that you got from your uncle?
Not really. As I say, you know, back in Wisconsin in the 1950s, I think they made a real effort to hide this background. I mean, I knew of Uncle Harry as being a very pious man. He was the president of the Orthodox congregation in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, but it never went beyond that. Not at all. No discussion of anything relevant. Subsequently, though, I can say this. I grew up in a very loving family. I never doubted. Excuse me. I never doubted, not for one moment, that I was loved.
Yeah.
And not just my parents, but, you know, aunts and uncles. There was very, very strong bonds in the family. And I knew that and particularly on my father's side, on my mother's side, less so, I think, but we lived thousands of miles away from them. Well, 1,000 miles away in Wisconsin, as my mother's family was from New Jersey. My Aunt Jeanette, who was my father's older sister, told me a wonderful story once back in, I think it's 1947. I would have been 1 year old. There was a gathering of Hasidic rabbis in Chicago. And I believe that at that time, the Lubavitcher Rebbe from Lubavitch, the original Rabbi Schneerson, I believe it was, came to that meeting. And when my grandmother learned that he was going to be there, she insisted on traveling and taking the train from Fond du Lac to Chicago. They were meeting at a Jewish delicatessen somewhere in Chicago that had a meeting room in the back. So my aunt and my grandmother traveled 120 miles by train to Chicago, got to the restaurant, and my grandmother said she would like to speak with the rabbi. And of course they said, well, he's in a meeting, you can't. And so she said, pass him a note. Tell him that Chana Schwam is outside. Now, it turns out that my grandmother, when she lived in Russia, in Lubavitch, or in one of the surrounding communities, I'm not exactly sure, she wanted to study with the boys. And in that tradition, you probably know more than I do, the girls aren't allowed. But my grandmother was so devout that she insisted on sitting outside the door of the room where the rabbi was giving instruction to the boys. And the rabbi allowed that.
Incredible.
So when she passed the note to the rabbi that she was there, he came out, and when he saw her, according to my aunt, who was the eyewitness, he gave her a big hug, which, you know, for a Hasidic rabbi would have been forbidden, but he did it anyway.
Wow, true. That's some really true warmth and love. Wow, it's incredible. I'm going to do a very Lubavitch thing here. I'm going to ask Jeffrey, what's your Hebrew name?
Yehuda.
Yehuda. How do you feel about being, if I called you Yehuda? Are you comfortable with that? Cool. I'll tell you something. There's something quite funny here, which is my family my grandparents were born and raised in Russia and Poland. And they were not living in Hasidic families. They were living in Misnagdic families, the sort of the non-Hasidic version of Orthodoxy, which you're probably familiar with. But my grandfather, my father's father, ended up becoming close with boys from Lubavitch, and he raised his family subsequently in the footsteps of Lubavitch, and I was already born into a Lubavitch family. Firstly, we share the same, not only do we share the same Hasidic background, but the very particular Hasidic branch. And if anything, you have deeper roots in Lubavitch than I do. I'm like a Johnny-come-lately to Lubavitch, only 1 or 2 generations, but you go back all the way back to the source. So I really have to ask you some questions to learn about my own heritage here in this very particular way.
You probably know much more about it than
there's knowing and there's knowing, though. Good. So let's transition back to your education. So you begin to get interested in the spiritual, in the otherworldly, in the extraordinary, the paranormal. So pick us back up there, and we'll sort of try and interweave your own spiritual journey and academic journey, and we'll try to make sense of who you are together.
All right. Well, really, by the time I got into college, I was a pretty secular person. I had been active in the Jewish youth group in high school, the B'nai B'rith youth organization. And I attended something when I was 15. They called it LTC, Leadership Training Camp, which was very meaningful to me, actually. We learned Israeli folk dances and songs. But what really struck me at the time was a book, and some of the discussions we had, they passed out this book called Be True to Yourself. And it dawned on me that was a path I wanted to follow, to be true to myself. And that meant, I had very religious cousins. I had a cousin, my first cousin, Bernie, with whom I'm still very close. We were almost the same age. But he went off to yeshiva and studied, you called it the mitnagim?
Yes.
Yeah, he would, I suppose, fit into that branch of Judaism. He used to, for example, tear all the toilet paper in advance of the Shabbos, so he wouldn't have to tear toilet paper on the Shabbos. And that just struck me as, I don't know, it struck me as, at the time, as ridiculous, to be honest. And maybe looking back on it, it was sort of a youthful teenage attitude. I have a lot of respect for my cousins. So, but at the time, I broke away from Judaism once I got, which is the same thing my father did. Once he got out of the household, my father used to tell me he prays every night. He says the Shema every day, but that was it for my father. The rest of his life was, he ran a store, he had a business, and he became a typical Jewish businessman. And in a way, it was sad for me. to be honest.
Hmm.
But I began, living a pretty secular life as soon as I went off to college. But then, this is in the 1960s, again, before you were born, but it was a very turbulent era. There was the Vietnam War. There was college students were using psychedelic drugs, reading about Timothy Leary. And I took psychedelic drugs, of course, because that was sort of what the cutting edge of my own generation was doing. And to be honest, it opened me up to very profound altered states of consciousness that triggered my curiosity once again, like, what's going on here? And that's when I decided to, as you mentioned, I wrote a senior honors thesis on the psychology of religious mysticism. And to be honest, even though I was having these profound, I would call them mystical experiences through the use of LSD and other drugs, I still was pretty much a rationalist materialist. And I assumed that we would find scientific answers that would explain all of these things. But as I began my reading in this area, the psychology of religious mysticism, I encountered people, writers, who were writing about it quite differently. Abraham Maslow was a very prominent psychologist, and he studied some of the most successful, prominent people of his era, people like Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Helen Keller. And they described what they called, or what he came to call, peak experiences, which he said are indistinguishable from classical mystical experiences, which are also very hard to distinguish from the kinds of experiences people had using drugs as well. And as a result of that, they said these experiences are central to their life, to their sense of mission, purpose, and accomplishment. And therefore, it would be a mistake to take the typical Freudian perspective and say that mystical experience is like a regression to the state of infancy. Right. No, it's something quite different. You could say it's a transcendent state, an awakening of higher consciousness in which people get in touch with a deeper sense of life purpose and a connection to all of humanity, and a striving to make their life meaningful, not just for themselves, but for the world as a whole. And so by the time I had graduated as an undergraduate, that was my perspective. This is even before I had the dream of Uncle Harry. I had come to develop through readings in psychology, really, the importance of the mystical experience.
And did you connect any of this new understanding back to your family's Hasidic or Jewish heritage, or were you finding new avenues of expression and exploration?
Well, I was reading Martin Buber, but at that point, and really even up until today, I consider myself something of a universalist, and which to me is true Judaism. To be honest, I mean, I think of myself as being very Jewish, but not in a conventional sense. In fact, if you push me on it, I probably tell you I think Judaism took a wrong turn with Moses.
So it's a line that I've heard you saying before, and I want to come back to ask you what you mean by that. But I want to try and move systematically and chronologically here, because the story is a really phenomenal story, and I think the story of every human is the story of the divine in the microcosm. So I do know that in a point of the story you had a very pivotal 8 hours in Israel.
Oh, yes. 8 hours. Yes, I've only been in Israel for 8 hours. That would have been, it was in the 1990s, as I recall. I was on a cruise. My wife and I were taking a Mediterranean cruise, and it stopped in Ashdod for 8 hours. And we took the taxi to Jerusalem. It was on a Friday. And everything was just closing down for the Shabbos. And my wife and I found ourselves alone in the Garden of Gethsemane and alone in the Church of the Sepulchre. It was very powerful and a profound experience. But, you know, I wouldn't have told you if at the time I didn't know that anything deep really was going on, because we went shopping. And in fact, we purchased some incredible Egyptian antiques that had come out of the Sinai Peninsula, and we were very happy we had, you know, our treasures. And but then that would have been probably in August. Then, you know, we got back, we were living in California, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur come along, the high holidays. I had not been at that point in my life to a high holiday service for, I don't know, 20, maybe even 30 years, a long time. And something inside of me said, you can't just treat this as another secular day showing up at the office, which had been my pattern at that point, because I had rejected Judaism. And I think the reason I had, looking back on it, growing up in a small town in the 1950s, you'd go to the synagogue and the Jewish people would be praying and crying. And why were they crying? They'd lost their relatives. The Holocaust had such a deep impact. And I began to appreciate that my generation, you know, had turned away from Judaism in vast numbers. It's as if Hitler couldn't have done it, as much as the pain of being around people who were in such grief. And I began to appreciate that I needed to do something about it. That, you know, it might be perfectly fine to leave your religion, but you need to do it for the right reasons. I wasn't yet ready to go to a synagogue. But what I did do is I stayed home. I went to the library. I got all these Jewish prayer books from the library, and I took them home with me. And I decided I would spend Yom Kippur reading in the Jewish prayer books. And frankly, most of it was not very inspirational. So many of the Jewish prayers I noticed were, you know, Lord, seek vengeance upon my enemies. That didn't resonate with me at all. But I found a prayer book from the Reconstructionist movement of Judaism. And it was a poem. And the poem went something like this. It said, one day, the Spirit of the Lord will come and will breathe the breath of life on the bones of all of those who were killed. And the Lord will say, wake up, wake up. But the bones will not wake up. The bones will say to the Lord, why should we wake up? Why should we? Why should we listen to you when you didn't listen to us in our hour of need? And when I read that and thought about how so many Jews of my generation were drifting away. And not that it was a bad thing, but, what are the reasons? I had a good Jewish friend who became a rabbi, went to Israel. He's now passed on. David Zeller. He was a student of Shlomo Carlebach, and he played the guitar and sang songs. And he pointed out to me at one time, look at the 20th century. Who are the most influential people of the 20th century? They were all secular Jews, Einstein, Freud, and Marx. Secular Jews were making enormous contributions to global culture. But I decided that it's called Teshuvah. I returned. But the only synagogue where I lived in San Rafael, California, they had one synagogue. It was a Reform synagogue. So I began showing up. I love Jewish music. I think the rabbi noticed right away that I would go into, I guess you'd have to say, ecstatic states during the worship service. And I became very active. I was putting on tefillin. We were having, in a Reform synagogue, that's very rare, but we were having minyans in the morning. I was showing up every morning for the minyan with a few friends to put tefillin on in the synagogue, and becoming very involved in the local synagogue. Much more than is ever expected in a Reform synagogue.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Although the rabbis there, the male and female rabbis, were both very happy to see us being so active in the community. And my father died in August of '97. And then I went back to Wisconsin. At that time, I was quite close to Rabbi Zalman, Reb Zalman.
How did you get to know Reb Zalman?
Well, I was doing interviews. I started I got my degree in parapsychology in 1980. I was libeled. I fought a libel suit in 1986. I finally cleared my name. The enemies of parapsychology can be quite vicious. And after successfully winning a libel suit, I felt my reputation has been restored. I had some money. I bought some real estate. And I started this TV series, the original Thinking Aloud series. And Reb Zalman was a guest on the program, and I got to know him and his wife quite well. In those days, I would travel down to Los Angeles, and where he was leading services for the high holidays. He was a beautiful man, a very inspirational person. And when my father died, he reached out to me, and he had all of these rituals that he wanted me to do. Wear a bathrobe for some reason, and other things. And I guess it rubbed me the wrong way. I didn't want to have him interfering at that time as if he was, I considered him a dear friend, a person I love, but I didn't consider him like a spiritual director of my life. In any case, after the funeral, I was on an airplane flying back to California. And I was thinking, now that my father has died, I will become even more active in the synagogue, because we have to have Shiva. We have to sit Shiva. Have to, more prayers. And I will even increase my involvement. And at that moment, while I'm thinking this, I could hear my father speaking to me very plainly, not auditorily, but inwardly. And he said, son, if you want to get more active in Judaism, do it for yourself. Don't do it for me. I don't need it. And it was at that moment that I realized I had completed my teshuvah. I had gone back to the Jewish religion. I wasn't going to leave it because I was avoiding the pain of the grief and the Holocaust. I was leaving it for a better reason. I was leaving it to be true to myself. And so within a month or so, I did. I said my goodbyes. It was Yom Kippur. I was called to the Torah to say the blessings on Yom Kippur at the synagogue because I had become such an active participant. But that was the last time I've been in a synagogue. And I've just been, on my own path ever since. That's the story of my return to Judaism and leaving Judaism really for the second time. But I don't feel like I'm leaving it.
Right.
It almost feels more like it's leaving me in a way. I feel like, it's very interesting being in parapsychology. I meet people who are on the forefront of various spiritual movements around the planet. They could be Buddhists, or they could be yogis, they could be parapsychology researchers. But everywhere I go, I find Jewish people. and they're in the forefront of almost every endeavor that I find of interest, and not only in the spiritual realms, but in secular realms. If you're talking physics or law or medicine or biology or any form of science or scholarship, any kind of intellectual endeavor, there are always Jewish people amongst the leadership.
Right.
And it could be in business as well.
Yeah, there is something in the Jewish spirit that doesn't let us rest.
Yeah.
That doesn't quite give us peace. Wow, thank you so much for sharing that very personal and intimate spiritual journey with us. I'm really fascinated by this theme of being true to oneself, being authentic in one's own spirituality and in one's own religion. And in many cases, that does take a rejection in sort of the Freudian sense to kill the father, to leave behind the spiritual or religious messages that we receive from early generations and to find that message fresh and new for ourselves. And I know that you've spoken about this and you've thought about this, and I want to ask you, in a generation where the tendency is to leave behind the tradition of the ages and to see much of the past as superstitious and much of the God of the old, being dead, as Nietzsche declared, how do we, in this postmodern, in the secular world, how do we, in a way that's true to ourselves and true to that, how do we create meaning in our lives in 2020 in a world like today? How do we find meaning? How do you create meaning?
Well, it's up to each person to do that. I have found a way that seems to work very well for me. But I suppose you could say, in the case of my father who prayed the Shema every day, this most important message of Judaism is the Lord is one. And to me, that means I am one with the Lord. And the Lord is one with everything. And I am one with everything. And I embrace the whole universe. That's, to me, the real inner meaning of the Shema. And for me, that means there's no other, there's no outsider, there are no goyim in that sense. We're all intimately connected, which is the same message now that's coming out of quantum physics and that idea of quantum entanglement. Everything literally is interrelated, everything. So my message is there are people, I run into them all the time, who they see an enemy somewhere. The enemy is a diabolic entity, and that enemy, it could be the Jews, it could be the bankers, it could be the blacks, it could be the Catholics, it could be the poor, it could be the rich, sometimes the Hindus and sometimes the Muslims. And to me, what that is in Jungian terms, that's projection. There is no enemy.
We'd say there is no other even, right?
There's no other. That's
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. I mean, it's incredible because the doctrine that you're now espousing, which I deeply believe in, and the whole project which we've begun now here at Seekers of Unity, Project Unity, is about trying to really manifest that unity and make it real. And I think it's a very rich point to bring up, because I think it really is the metaphysical core of all of these truths and all of these systems. What I wonder though is, and living in a practical world, we don't have the luxury just to escape to the top of the mountain and lose ourselves in the bliss of, the oneness of divinity, or the oneness of everything. How do we take that message? How do we take that message, which I think we all deeply believe in, and that means all the traditions? And how do we manifest that and make that a reality in our lives? How do we live a life of oneness? And I'd like to turn that to you. How do you find space in your own life to make that idea real?
Well, of course, for me, with the New Thinking Aloud video channel, one of the ways I do it is I have dialogues with guests from every tradition. I've had a lot of meaningful conversation recently with a fellow from Ekankar, which I used to think of as a cult, and I'm coming to a new appreciation of it. I know Reb Zalman, who I loved, would go and pray with Muslims.
Yes.
I think it's very important to dialogue with people, not to shut people out. I have one of the favorite guests on the New Thinking Aloud channel is a person who's been labeled a Nazi, Jason Reza Georgiani. I love that man, and I think he's been misunderstood and mislabeled. But even Nazis, I think, are human beings. They are not other either. And people who, people often label me as other because I'm Jewish, and
right.
there's plenty of anti-Semitism still in the world. I come to appreciate that. I don't want to. I do draw a line. There's a point at which I will not tolerate racist rhetoric on the New Thinking Aloud channel. Certainly not by my guests, but even amongst the commenters. However, as much as possible, I reach out to those people and embrace them.
Yes.
And try and hear them. What is their concern? And it's often, they feel wounded, they feel aggrieved, they're in pain.
Yeah. I that's really beautiful. I have to tell you that personally, I've been very inspired by your dialogues and by your conversations. And initially, just as someone who was researching the paranormal, the mystical, the spiritual, the transcendent, much of the characters who I was interested in hearing their thoughts were people who you were able to pull the thoughts out of them. And so that was what initially brought me to you. But then seeing the spirit of openness and the spirit of dialogue really motivated me in my own path. I mean, growing up in a Hasidic community, which is quite insular, doesn't really afford one much opportunity to meet with mystics from other traditions. But in a very small way now, just in the past year now, I've opened my own channel where I interview Sufi Muslims and Christian mystics, hopefully soon. I interviewed a Sikh just the other day, which is very cool. And opening up dialogue and allowing people to share their truth has been so incredible. And what I've discovered is that their truth is no different than my truth, and no different than the Muslim's truth, and no different than the Buddhist's truth. So I have to thank you for showing the way in dialogue and showing the possibility for that openness and for that appreciation of the other.
Well, the funny thing is, I found that very often the mystics of different traditions have more in common with each other than they have with the orthodox of their own tradition.
Yes, that is it's a true point, and it's an incredible point. It blows the mind actually to really think about that and to experience that.
Yeah.
I want to push back here a little, because I think that part of having a spiritual conversation is also being critical about our spirituality. Yeah. And I'm sure you're familiar with the perennialist and the traditionalist traditions and schools of thought, which have taken many different various forms throughout history. I don't need to tell you about them. But something interesting which happened in the late, in the 1900s in the traditionalist and the perennialist school is many of them actually took on one specific religious tradition. Many of the early traditionalists became Sufis. And there was something in their teaching where they affirmed the universality of religion and of mysticism, of metaphysics. And that was really their core message, and a message which I deeply connect to. And yet in practice, they chose to anchor themselves very deeply in the nuance and in the particularism of one very specific tradition. And for them, for many of them, it was Islam, but for others, it was Christianity and whatnot. And I'm curious to know, I'm very curious about that relationship and that dance between religious particularism and universalism. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that and your experience in that regard.
Well, to my knowledge, the people who did that were looking for what they thought of as an authentic initiation, an initiation into the deeper mysteries. And they found it in Sufism, at least to their own satisfaction. And some of these same people, René Guénon, probably the most prominent, they were very critical of new religions because they felt, the new religions, they didn't carry that authentic initiatory tradition, a lineage of some sort. And so I think that's what motivated them. I tend to have a different opinion than
Please
that.
do share.
Well, I think that it's possible to initiate oneself. I don't believe you have to have a guru. I had a very important teacher in my life, the psychologist Jean Houston, and she said, well, guru means, gee, you are you. So that's been my path. And I'm not urging anybody. I don't care what path any person chooses. If it seems to resonate with the core of their being, then that's probably right for them. There are thousands of choices a person can make. And I find people doing it with integrity. And, you could be a carpenter and do it with great integrity.
Right. So that's a very interesting message to be one's own guru and to initiate oneself is a very interesting idea. This is my dog in the background here. I hope he's not disturbing too much. I wonder though, and just to push on a little further here, do you see, you have a very keen finger on the pulse of today's spiritual communities and very varied communities. It's not fair to paint them with a single brush, but do you find that there's too much at times dilettantism or too much, the buffet style spirituality and new age practice where people don't really focus in and don't have the discipline that spirituality at times really demands?
I suppose you could say that. I've probably been as guilty as anybody of that sort of thing. I've practiced over the years, all sorts of disciplines. So again, I think everybody is going to have to figure that out for themselves. To me, we live in an era in which the spiritual traditions of the world are everybody's inheritance. We now live in a global culture. And so many people say, stick with one religion, stick with your tradition. You'll go further that way. And I think that's just fine for people who want to do that. And for people who want to be more experimental, and you could say dilettantish, it depends on, I think the best way to put it is how deep they go within themselves. Because on the one hand, you might say somebody is a dilettante, and then on the other hand, if they're approaching everything from a deep place within themselves and absorbing it all, they can become a master of their own world.
That's a really interesting idea, that the focus and direction is not how deep you get into the religion, but how deep does that allow you to get into yourself? And that may take the form of one religion or many. That's a very interesting thought. Thank you. Really interesting. I want to switch back your attention to something that you said both now and earlier about Jewish theology, a passion of mine. And you said in another interview that you love music but not the theology, and you said that you feel like the Jewish religion took a wrong turn with Moses. And I would love if you would elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, let me see if I can do that. I guess my problem with Moses began once when I was in the Reform synagogue, and it was Passover, and they brought in a gospel group from the neighboring Baptist church. And the gospel singers decided to honor the Jews celebrating Passover by singing a rendition of Let My People Go. It was a beautiful song, but then I heard the words carefully, and it goes something like, Thus saith the Lord, bold Moses said, let my people go, or else I'll strike your children dead. Let my people go. So at that moment, it dawned on me, what? God is threatening to kill innocent children? Wait a second. I didn't buy it. I just don't buy it. I know it's, the books of Moses, that's the key event. And as far as I'm concerned, I don't believe that that's what God did. I don't believe that that's what God does. So what I found growing up in Judaism is a kind of tribalism, where you've got, the insiders and the outsiders. And that's the opposite of embracing the universe.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on a lot of those points. I was actually very curious to know what exactly it was that your beef with Moses was. And that's a very fair point. And that goes back to the theme of not othering, of not seeing the other as an enemy. There's a very interesting idea in Jewish theology, which is that you find this in many spiritual traditions, where there's two states of consciousness. There's a state of exile and there's a state of redemption or enlightenment. And in Judaism, we would call that galut and geula. And it's only in that state of exile, in that state of contracted consciousness, where we do identify the other as the enemy. But once we move into the state of redemption, the state of the messianic space, then all of those distinctions fall away, and there is no longer enemy. There is no longer, evil in another person. And it's a very interesting idea. And we kind of live between those two worlds sometimes.
Well, we do. Another way to express it, I've heard as a Hasidic story, you probably have heard, of Moses, who goes up to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah, or to receive the word of God, and he comes down with a tablet. And according to this Hasidic story, I can't remember where I heard it, this is the tablet of the Torah of the tree of life. And he comes down and he sees the children of Israel worshiping the golden calf. And he gets angry and he smashes the tablet. And according to legend, the letters fly back up to heaven. And so Moses has to go back up to Mount Sinai a second time. This time he comes down with a different tablet, actually. It's the tablet of the Torah of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Instead of the tree of life, and which means the dualist perception, yes. The perception of good and evil. I give you a choice: choose life or choose death. From my perspective, there is no difference between life or death. I can embrace them both.
You're more of a first tablets kind of guy.
Yeah.
I'll tell you something interesting, which today, by the way, the 17th of Tammuz, commemorates the day when Moses broke those first luchot. And today is a fast day, known as one of the minor fasts. Yeah, I'm actually right now, I'm in a bit of like an interesting mind space, because I haven't eaten or drunk anything since the morning. Which is quite a cool experience. And it's funny that you mentioned that the breaking of the luchot. And another interesting idea, which always struck me as very rich, is that the luchot were later kept in the Ark of the Covenant, which was kept in the Holies of Holies in the Temple in Jerusalem. Most people would probably know them from Indiana Jones, the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Right.
And according to one Jewish tradition, besides for the complete tablets, the Ten Commandments that were kept there, in addition to that, the broken tablets were kept alongside with the complete tablets, which means that even though that ideal unity is in a state of brokenness and the state of shatteredness, we still treasure the brokenness. We still treasure the shattered unity and hold that dear. We're almost coming on an hour here, and I like to respect the time of my cherished guests and not take them on for too long. So I just want to end with two questions and then ask you to share if there are any current projects which you're working on and exciting and I want to share with the audience. The two questions I want to ask, one is, I know that your primary area of scholarship and research is in psychic phenomena, and being myself somewhat of an outsider to that area, and my interest has been more in the field of mysticism from a global historical and philosophical sense. How would you distinguish between psychic phenomena and mysticism as categories, if there's a way to distinguish between them?
Well, that's a very good question. I would probably put it this way, they're very related
Mm-hmm.
to each other. Pretty much, if you're on a mystical path, you're going to run into psychic phenomena along the way. But not every psychic needs to be a mystic.
Mm-hmm.
There are people who have very strong psychic gifts. It's a natural gift, I think, sort of like musical ability or mathematical ability.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little deeper than either of those.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe more related to poetic talent or literary talent. But in any case, you can be very psychic without being mystical at all. I think, though, it's hard to be a mystical person without having some exposure to the psychic.
What does mystical mean to you? What is a mystic in your estimation?
It's very simple. It's really what we've been talking about all along. I think the great mystics in every tradition talk about you reach a state where you recognize you are one with everything. That's the fundamental underpinning of mysticism. I like to think that it's the fundamental underpinning of all of my work as well when I'm doing it properly.
Nice.
I know there's much more that can be said about it.
No. That's perfect. That's enough said, and that's the definition which I very much gravitate to. I know there's like hundreds of definitions of mysticism, but I think that one is really hits the nail on the head. Final question I'd like to ask you before turning the floor to you to share if you're up to anything now, which is exciting, which I'm sure you are. And I know this might be like picking between favorite books or favorite children, but amongst the hundreds of interviews with the incredible people really people that are really manifesting the unity of divinity in their own lives, are there any interviews which really, or any of the characters which you encountered in those interviews which really stood out to you and which really moved you in deep ways?
Well, I don't know that this was the best interview, but one person probably has stood out as being the most inspirational person in my life, and that's Jean Houston. I mentioned her earlier. Guru.
Yes. I'm going to have to go watch those interviews now and see. I mean, I'm just in awe of your capacity to sit there and really conduct these interviews, because the presence of some of these people must have been just so immense and powerful and blissful.
Well, I feel the same way about being with you, Zevi.
Oh, wow.
I can tell you are beginning to launch what will be a very significant development, not only in your life, but for many other people as well. And it's reflected in your being. So wow. I'm honored to be with you.
Wow. Thank you so much. That's such a kind blessing. And I really hope to be able to continue spreading a message of unity, which you've been spreading. And likewise, I feel sitting with you that unity just radiating through you. I think that's so kind. Wow. I'm a bit at a loss for words. So Yehuda, Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your heart and your mind and your presence. It's been an absolute pleasure. And I want to invite you to share any projects which you're engaged in, any upcoming things which we can look out for.
Well, we're, of course, on the New Thinking Aloud YouTube channel. I'm putting up at least 3 videos every week, but we're starting to do more. We have a live stream event scheduled for the 16th of July, and we're going to have a what we call a spoon bending party, an opportunity, based on the Israeli psychic.
Uri Geller. Yes.
I sponsored his first major appearance in the United States back in the early 1970s. And whenever Uri would appear in front of an audience and he'd do his spoon bending, people would call up, people at home would, if it was like on a radio or TV show, and I've done many with him, they would say, "It's happening in my house. This watch that hasn't run for years is running now," or the forks are bending right in front of my eyes. So we're going to have an opportunity for our viewers to take out their silverware and see if any of them will bend, because that phenomenon began with Uri, but it's been going on, all around the world since then, independently of Uri Geller.
Wow, that's incredible. That sounds very exciting, and I'm excited to see what the results of that will be and what kind of energy can be conjured. And I mean, what I love about you is that you really don't care to go off into what other people consider the fringes of phenomena. You really have, like, there's a braveness to you that I mean, I don't know who else would conduct a live spoon vending party on
Well,
the
I've
internet, but
seen
that's
too
incredible.
many things, and I know it's real. And in spite of people who say it's either not real, or if they think it's real, they say it's evil, stay away from it. And neither of those are true. It's real and it's not evil.
Incredible. Incredible. What a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Jeffrey. Thank you, Huda, for sharing yourself with us. And thank you for being here. It was an absolute pleasure and an absolute honor. And I really hope to stay in touch. And I hope to
Likewise,
continue to learn from you and continue to be friends
I'd
going
be very
forward.
happy to stay in touch with you, Zevi. I think you're doing wonderful work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Have an amazing day. And thank you.
You're very welcome.